The Stamp Act and Sugar Act. So the thing is, rewinding a second to before the French and Indian War, as early as like the 1750s, British officials had actually attempted to curb some of the American legislature's power. It was things like they had set up this idea of the king's approval. It specifically was over Virginia's colony, where for Virginia's colony to make any kind of law or modify any existing law, they had to have a clause in it that basically said they had to have the king's approval for that law before it goes into effect. This was problematic, though, in that it basically hampered Virginia's colony's ability to respond to emergencies. And because they have to, send the law basically to England, and the king has to approve it, and then all the way back, and so on and so forth. We also see that, like, the Parliament had taken steps to forbid the issuing of paper money in New England in, like, 1751. The problem was there was an overabundance of money being printed, and this means that these notes would depreciate to be only a fraction of their face value. This actually then they expanded out in 1764 in the Currency Act to all of the different colonies. This happened, though, right as a lot of the colonies were in a slight economic recession, and so people in the colonies found them especially burdensome. So the idea of that Parliament wanted to curb the Assembly's power is not new after the French and Indian War, but it becomes a bigger deal. It becomes a bigger deal because of these two particular acts, the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act. So the Sugar Act was in 1764, and it was basically trying to bring revenue into the kingdom, the British Empire. And it was about generating funds by basically having legislation that would combine new and revised duties on colonial imports. So things that people bought in the colonies from other places. It also did things like it lengthened the list of enumerated products. Remember, those are the products that can only be sent to England or a destination within the British Empire itself. It also did things like it required ships to carry these new elaborate documents that certified the legality of their cargoes. So basically it's really coming down hard on smuggling. And even to enforce these regulations, they would use the Royal Navy to seize smugglers' ships, and they would try violations of this law in a new Vice Admiralty Court in Halifax, which is in Nova Scotia. The thing is, a Vice Admiralty Court operates without a jury, and so you're actually more likely to be convicted in a Vice Admiralty Court. The other thing is Halifax is pretty remote, and so Americans actually immediately oppose this provision, and they bring up the fact that Halifax was so far away. And so in response, Parliament was like, fine, and they actually went on to set up three more other Vice Admiralty courts, one in Boston, one in Philadelphia, and one in Charleston. And Americans that protested were like, that's not really what we had in mind. They had wanted them to get rid of this idea. And then the second of these is the Stamp Act that was in 1765. This basically required all valid legal documents, as well as things like newspapers, playing cards, and various other papers to bear a government-issued stamp. And there was a charge for this stamp. This is like getting something notarized, but imagine getting like playing cards notarized. Or I've seen it compared to online, and I love this analogy. What if you had to pay a tax every time you opened a new web page on the internet? Yeah, imagine how much you would have to pay. Thing is, this is a big deal because the Stamp Act is the first internal tax placed on the American colonies as opposed to like an external trade duty. And it also brings up this question, does Parliament really have the right to impose this kind of direct tax on Americans when Americans have no actual elected representative in Parliament? So I ask you, as part of your journal, thinking about the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act, how can you compare these to taxes and laws today? What is the same? What is different? Feel free to pause if you want to go ahead and answer this or write down something, because I'm going to move on in about 5-10 seconds. So, what was the initial American response? Well, some Americans were puzzled, some were shocked, others are outraged. The thing is, Americans had expected that after the French and Indian War, they would be, rewarded for their efforts. And now they're being taxed. Not exactly the response they were looking for. Parliament, up till this moment, had really customarily refrained from taxing them, especially any direct taxes. And so Americans always assumed that Parliament couldn't really tax them because their own assemblies already taxed them, and they viewed basically their own legislatures as their own parliaments. So think if we as Americans today were taxed only by the state government and never by the federal government, was the idea that, oh, we voted people into power in our state government, so they tax us, but we didn't vote anyone into power in our federal government, so they can't tax us. That's obviously not what the reality is, but I'm just trying to give you a proper analogy to today. Most Americans at this time believed that it was really depriving them of the right to be taxed only by their own elected representatives, and that this is basically trying to deny them of one of their most basic rights as an Englishman. The thing is, a lot of Americans at this time are going to be drawn to an idea known as country ideology. Now, country ideology has two really big assumptions. The first assumption is that, well, basically human beings are selfish, and because we as a people are selfish, we need governments to protect us from each other. So that's the first assumption. We're selfish, so we need governments to protect each other from each other. The second is that governmental power, no matter how necessary it is, and no matter who you entrust it to, is going to be inherently aggressive and expansive. So because government power is, inherently aggressive, expansive, it's really important that you have men of, sufficient property and judgment really in these places of powers, that the men in our government have to be virtuous. They have to avoid political partisanship. These representatives have to have appropriate social status. I also talked about sufficient property. The idea behind that is that, oh, they can't be bribed because they already have money. Which, yeah, there we go. There's some issues with that, but not going into that. This is an idea. And this idea is that these men would have to exhibit proper behavior and therefore deserve the deference of their constituents. And of course, if they don't exhibit this virtuous behavior, this proper behavior and everything, they of course could then be voted out of office. So the thing is, Americans, this idea really appeals to them because there's an element of this ideal that is suspicion of those in power. And there was a lot of local rivalries politically at this time. And people generally liked this insistence on this important political role. That they felt like it was their duty to safeguard the freedom of their constituents. But there's also a little bit more to country ideology. Really, when you're looking at that, that means that you know who you're voting into office. And that means you're valuing that local control, but kind of expecting the worst from a far and remote government. And that once again brings us back to this idea of really who has the right to tax who.